Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first installment of the Marshall Scholar Series presented by the John Marshall Center for Constitutional History and Civics. I'm Jenny Reedy, board member at the center and chairman of the Education Committee, and I will be your moderator this evening. The new Marshall Scholar Series is designed to engage the public by offering access to constitutional scholars, legal experts, and historians on relevant and trending topics. Tonight, we are joined by retired professor of law, Beth Hopkins, who will discuss the history of race and access to education in America and will spotlight the contributions of some extraordinary African-American women. Professor Hopkins is a graduate of Wake Forest University and the William and Mary Law School. She began her legal career in Richmond as an associate in Oliver Hill's office and then served as an assistant attorney general in Richmond and as assistant U.S. attorney in Richmond and Shreveport, Louisiana. Professor Hopkins then spent over 30 years at Wake Forest University. Her posts there include 10 years in the university's legal counsel's office, a professor to both undergraduates and law students, and serving as the inaugural director at the Smith Anderson Center for Community Outreach at the law school, where she transformed the Wake Forest Pro Bono Project. Professor Hopkins has repeatedly been on the front lines of integration. She was among the first group of students of color to integrate Petersburg High School in 1964. As an undergraduate at Wake Forest, she was one of the first to integrate their dormitories and was the first Black homecoming queen. She was the first Black woman in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Richmond and the first to represent VMI. In 2016, Professor Hopkins was honored with the Martin Luther King Jr. Dare to Make a Difference Award in recognition of her efforts for human and civil rights. She is a current member of the board of directors of the John Marshall Center. At the conclusion of Professor Hopkins' remarks, she will be joined for a question and answer session by a former member of our board, the Honorable Roger Gregory, Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. Judge Gregory grew up in Petersburg, Virginia, and is a graduate of Virginia State College and the University of Michigan Law School. He is a former partner of the law firm of Wilder and Gregory. Judge Gregory is the first African-American to sit on the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit and has the distinction of being the only person appointed to a federal appellate court by two presidents of different parties. He received a recess appointment from President Bill Clinton in December of 2000 and a lifetime commission to the court in July of 2001 by President George W. Bush. Judge Gregory became Chief Judge on July 9, 2016, and is a member of the Judicial Conference of the United States. The numerous awards and honorary degrees awarded to him include the National Conference of Christians and Jews Humanitarian Award, the National Bar Association's Gertrude E. Rush and Equal Justice Awards, and the Washington Bar Association's Charles Hamilton Houston Merit Medallion. Thank you both so much for being here tonight. Before I turn the screen over completely to Beth to begin her presentation, I just wanted to let the audience know that if you would like to submit a question for our Q&A at the end of the presentation, you can do so by using the chat feature on Zoom. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Beth.
Oh, thank you, Jenny, for that kind introduction. And hello to my friends in North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, New York. Hello to my family, my neighbors, my childhood friends, my colleagues who helped me in my career. Also to the members of the John Marshall Foundation Board and Judge Gregory, thank you for joining me this evening for this trip through a few African-American women who have contributed substantially to the road to Brown and beyond. And audience, please understand, this is just a slice of the pie. By no means is this a full and exhaustive list of the women who have made education for children of color in America possible. And also understand that the road to Brown was not an easy one. It was hard fought and it was not paved with gold. And with respect to the early laws of educating slaves during the colonial period, the laws weren't quite as restrictive because the slaves were taught to read the scriptures. However, around 1740 in South Carolina, South Carolina became one of the first states, the early states, prohibiting slave education, targeting writing to prevent forged passes and rebellious writings. But hear this, the slaves could be taught math because they needed to count the bales of cotton. In the late 1700s, schools began to pop up in Boston in particular. Blacks in Boston opened up schools because the city council in Boston, and I'm saying Boston as in Massachusetts, refused to provide schools for Black children. Boston even passed laws preventing Black children from attending any other school except those specifically designed for them. Now walk with me, would you, to the 19th century in Virginia, where you can see that it was unlawful to teach slaves to read and write, and that the sworn officer or officers could inflict corporal punishment on the offenders at the discretion of any justice of the peace, mind you, not exceeding 20 lashes. In North Carolina in the 1830s, a law was also passed, and this one was a little bit more specific because if a white man or woman was caught teaching slaves to read or write, they were fined $100 to $200 or put in prison. A free person of color was put in prison or received lashes 20 to 39. And if a slave was caught teaching another slave to read or write, that slave received 39 lashes on a bare back in North Carolina. So we're going to jump a little bit to Nat Turner's revolt in 1831. And most of us experienced reading about this revolt in either middle school or high school. And we know that 55 to 65 whites who were living on plantations, plantation owners to be specific, were killed, and that the plantation owners responded by forming militias, and then mobs formed in Southampton County where 100 to 200 Blacks were killed. Plantation owners then went ballistic, and this fear dominated for the next 3 decades. Therefore, literacy among the slaves was not an option. The revolt of Nat Turner led to state legislatures prohibiting the education of slaves, restricting the right to assemble, and white ministers in some states were even required to be present at Black religious services. How about this one? In 1831, Mississippi passed a law mandating free African Americans to leave the state. And so we began to look at the road to Brown. And again, this list is not a complete list of all the cases that paved the road to Brown. I just took a little slice, but we have to start with the Roberts versus Boston case in 1850, which is considered the cornerstone case. This was a case by Black parents to end racial discrimination in Boston public schools. However, the state Supreme Court said that caste distinctiveness cannot be changed by law. And the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court ruled in favor of Boston, finding no constitutional basis for the lawsuit. This case was later cited by the US Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson, which we know established a separate but equal standard. And so a 19th century education was hard to acquire for Blacks. Between 1820 and 1860, education in the North was racially segregated because there was a general reluctance to fund schools for Black children. So underfunding, of course, led to dilapidated schools, crowded conditions, and underpaid teachers. And backing up before the Dred Scott case, there was an unfortunate incident in 1834 where a mob attacked a boarding school that had been erected for colored girls in Canterbury, Connecticut. This school had been established by a white woman by the name of Prudence Crandall. The crowd broke windows with iron bars, set the school on fire, and politicians responded by saying that colored people were never free from menial conditions. And so we move on from Roberts and jump to the Dred Scott case. This is the infamous case, again, that we all read about, where a slave traveled to a free state, came back to Missouri, filed for his freedom, and Missouri said, no way, Jose. And the justice of the Supreme Court there ruled that Blacks were not citizens of the United States and that Blacks had no rights which the white man had to respect. And so we see the tentacles of Dred Scott reaching from 1857 to 2021. Another case of which we have some familiarity is the Plessy versus Ferguson case. And to the right there, you see a picture of Mr. Plessy, who looked like a white man. And actually, he was an octoroon, about 1/8 Black. His sitting in the white only section was staged. So the train officials knew he was coming. He was arrested, and the committee that sort of organized this particular event thought that they might get a different result. But from Louisiana, it went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court announced the separate but equal doctrine. Now, we're going to move ahead a little bit, but first I must tell you that racists were busy in America during this period. There were lynchings of white and Black people. A Tuskegee Institute report states that from 1882 to 1951, there were over 4,800 lynchings. And not all lynchings occurred in the South. Sociologist Robert Gibson reports in his article, Lynching and Race Riots in the United States, that every state in the continental US had lynchings except Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Vermont. And so the experience of Black people was Jim Crow, race riots, the migration from 1916 to 1930, and of course, the blood of Black soldiers ran in the streets during the Red Summer of 1929. So let's fast forward to the Gaines case. And again, there were a number of cases in between, but there are some education scholars who believe that this Gaines versus Canada case is the most important case after Plessy. And here we see a gradual chipping away at the separate but equal doctrine. We're not jumping fast forward now. We're just starting to chip away at it a little bit, because here the Supreme Court held that the state had to provide a law school education for Blacks, though not in the same school. Now, don't get it twisted, but it was a 14th Amendment violation not to present the same educational opportunities for law school for Blacks as it did for whites. Now, interesting enough, Missouri argued that, look, Mr. Gaines can go anywhere in the United States and go to law school, and Missouri would pay for it. We just are not interested in having him come to a Missouri law school. But the court didn't buy that argument and found that a separate law school should be provided. Unfortunately, Mr. Gaines never saw the fruit of his labor, because he walked away from the dormitory, I'm told, to go to a store to run an errand, and he just disappeared. So he never saw the outcome of his case. Another famous case along the line for the road to Brown is the Scipio case, which is considered the precursor to Brown. Here, the Supreme Court ordered a female student admitted to an Oklahoma law school, but when she arrived at the school, in the classroom, she was put in a chair marked colored and roped off in the classroom. When she went to the library, she was unable to use the law school library and had to go to the state capitol. And when she went to the cafeteria, she was put in a guarded and chained area. However, some of her classmates crawled underneath the chain to dine with her. However, Ada Lois Scipio Fisher holds the distinction of being the first African-American woman to attend an all-white law school in the South. Now, in the middle of all this racial insanity that spread its wings across the nation, we have Mary McLeod Bethune from 1875 to 1955, fighting for the educational advancement of Black children. She was born in South Carolina, one of 17 children. And at the age of 9, she could pick 250 pounds of cotton a day. She attended Scotia Seminary School in Concord, North Carolina, and this was a school that had been established for the daughters of former slaves. This seminary is now Barbara Scotia College, and its benefactor was a Quaker woman in Colorado. And so after that, Mary McLeod Bethune went to a foreign missionary school, finished that, but get this, no church was willing to send an African American to Africa to do mission work. But it was fortuitous for us that she stayed in the United States, because at one point she went to Florida and rented an old house and enrolled 5 girls. But enrollment soon soared because of the unique economy of Florida. The mothers of many of those students were maids who worked for wealthy families that wintered in Florida, but in the summer they went north. And so some of these mothers had nowhere to leave their children. Bethune's boarding school then was an ideal solution, and the house soon became too small. Mary McLeod Bethune writes that there was nowhere for them to go except a hellhole, and she called it that, a hellhole, where her girls and Mrs. Bethune removed literally thousands of pounds of refuse in an old junkyard. In addition to basic academics, she taught practical skills such as laundry and cleaning techniques, broom making, and poultry care. She put a strong emphasis on Christian values, and especially she put emphasis on self-respect and confidence. Her students wore uniforms so there would be no disparity between those who received parental support and those without it. Now, she was very clever at raising money with a variety of innovative ideas, and the school's reputation began to grow. Now, it is recorded, and you may not believe this, but it is recorded that at one bazaar, she raised $5,000, which is the equivalent to about $77,000 in our money. And at this bazaar, she sold sweet potato pies and fried fish to construction crews, and of course, engaged in other items. But this school gradually began to grow. It became coeducational, and in 1943, the school was renamed Bethune, I'm sorry, in 1929, it was renamed Bethune-Cookman College and issued its first degrees in 1949. Bethune served as the president, even as she became a national and international figure. And she was smart enough to recruit some of America's richest people as trustees. On her board included John D. Rockefeller Jr. and James Gamble of Procter & Gamble. She was elected president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs in 1955 and became the founding member of the National Council of Negro Women. Despite all of her obligations, she still wrote weekly columns for several Black newspapers, including the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender. So even though racism may have been routine in 1931, she was so meritorious that she ranked 10th on the journalist list of America's most outstanding women. One of her most important achievements was that when she was given the opportunity to attend the 1945 founding conference of the United Nations, having been appointed by President Harry Truman. No other African nation or other nation sent a Black female delegate, and Mary McLeod Bethune represented all the world's women of color. And so among her many other honors, the US Post Office honored her with a first-class stamp in 1985. And most of us know that she was a dear friend of Eleanor Roosevelt's and highly respected an advisor on some issues for President Franklin Roosevelt. The most outstanding international Black woman leader from the 1920s to the 1950s, Mary McLeod Bethune died at age 80. And here's a picture of the school where the girls first boarded. Next, on our screen, we see the famous Mary Church Terrell. And she was born to former slaves, but her father was one of the South's first African-American millionaires. He was an entrepreneur. You can see that she majored in the classics at Oberlin and was fluent in 3 foreign languages. Her interest was in early education, and this was before it was nurseries were really established and kindergarten was established. So she was a proponent of nurseries and kindergartens way before the general public became enamored with those 2 categories. She was an advocate, certainly, for children's education, a founding member of the NAACP, and a founder of a national African-American sorority, Delta Sigma Theta sorority. She had a big voice, too, in the women's suffrage movement. Mary Church Terrell. I say this is one of my favorites, but they're all my favorites. This is Judge Constance Baker Motley, who was born in New Haven, Connecticut, the 9th of 12 children. She attended Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, then NYU, and received her law degree from the Columbia University School of Law. She eventually became associate counsel for the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, making her the lead trial attorney in a number of early and significant civil rights cases. In 1950, she wrote the original complaint in the case of Brown versus Board of Education, the first African-American woman to argue a case before the US Supreme Court in Meredith versus Fair. She successfully won James Meredith's effort to be the first Black student to attend the University of Mississippi in 1962. Motley was successful in 9 of the 10 cases she argued before the Supreme Court. A key legal strategist in the civil rights movement, she helped to desegregate Southern schools, buses, and lunch counters. In 1966, President Johnson named her a district court judge for the United States District Court of the Southern District of New York, making her the first African-American woman federal judge, a position she held, including a term as chief judge until her death. So let's take a look at the Brown case. It's actually a consolidation of cases. It's not just one case, but I'm only going to really discuss part of the Brown case and the differences between them. But because of the similarities between them, the cases were consolidated under the name of Brown. Out of Kansas, the case involved elementary school age Negro children. And I know some of you are wondering, what are we? I mean, at one time we were called colored, then Negro, then Black, and now African American. But we're all people of color. In this particular case, the parents sued for desegregation, but a federal 3-judge court ruled that segregation was detrimental, but all the buildings and transportation curricula were all the same. So we're not ready to say that there's a 14th Amendment violation as yet. And here's the last surviving plaintiff of Brown. And she said that, Ms. Zelma Henderson said that she joined the fight just to help the nation a little bit. The next case was out of South Carolina, the Briggs versus Elliott case. And this involved Black children in the elementary and high school level. And they were all combined in one school in Clarendon County, South Carolina. The Black facilities, or the facilities for the Black children, I should say, were found to be inferior, and the state was ordered to equalize the facilities. Admission to white schools was denied here. But what's interesting is that, and I'll show you Miss Eliza Briggs, what's interesting is that some children had to walk 5 to 6 miles in the rain and snow to attend classes because there were no buses for these students. Although there were over 30 buses for white students, there was not one bus for the Black students. And somewhere it is recorded that a few of the children had to walk 16 miles a day to attend class. You can see from my slide here that Briggs and her husband lost their jobs because they had filed this lawsuit. And I should add that the parents did ask for one bus, but the superintendent said that Black parents didn't pay enough to merit one bus, and it was an unfair burden to place on white parents. And so we move on to the Schoolhouse in Clarendon County. This is, now imagine 50 to 60 kids in this schoolhouse. And this was the schoolhouse that was the subject of the case that I just mentioned to you, Briggs versus Elliott. All right, most of the Virginians know about the Prince Edward County case. And this was a high school case. Virginia was ordered to provide equal curricular and transportation. And again, admission to a white school was denied. We are all familiar with this student-initiated quest for desegregation, the only case of its kind because of the efforts of young Barbara Rose Johns, a 16-year-old junior at Motley High School who organized a student strike. At the high school, there was no gym, no cafeteria, no teacher's restroom, and children had to sit near the wood stove to keep warm and had umbrellas in the room when water came through the ceiling when it rained. And so Mr. Hill told me that he was traveling at the time, and somehow she got him on the telephone. And she told him that he had to come to Farmville to see the school in which they received an education. And Mr. Hill said that he had a number of cases, over 100 cases pending at the time, and he was dealing with some rather sizable cases involving inequities in retirement for Black teachers. And he told her he just didn't see how he could do it, but she wouldn't let him off the phone. So he did drive to meet her and eventually met with the parents, and the rest is history. I mentioned here in the slide that after Brown, there was this massive resistance called the Southern Manifesto. This occurred after Brown, in which there were no funds for public schools. In Prince Edward County, Virginia, schools closed rather than integrate, while white children attended private schools. Many of the county's Black children did not attend school from 1959 to 1964, and they were called the lost generation of Prince Edward County. Now imagine how it is when our children would miss 2 days of school. And some of these young people missed 5 years of school. Some of these young children came to Petersburg, Virginia, where Judge Roger Gregory and I were in school. They came to my 4th grade class, and we were just astounded that schools had been shut down because we said it wasn't a holiday. So how is it your schools are shut down? Other parents sent their children to relatives throughout the United States so that they could get a public school education. Some were educated on buses where teachers held sessions, and then you had the lost generation. And here's a picture of Barbara Rose Johns in 1979 and the magnificent bronze and granite sculpture which was dedicated in her honor. And I think everybody in Virginia and everybody who visits Richmond ought to see this sculpture. All right, the next case was out of Delaware. This involved Black children in the elementary and high school age areas as well. Segregation was required in Delaware, and there was only one college preparatory school for Black children in the whole state. Now, this case is a little bit different because here the state Supreme Court ordered admissions to schools on a non-segregated basis. Remember, in Kansas and South Carolina and Virginia, admission had been denied. So you had the parents from the other 3 cases and this case, this Delaware case, appealing to the Supreme Court. Here's a picture of Ethel Louise Belton, who rode the bus 2 hours every day so that she could get courses offered at a white high school that would prepare her for college. So what did Brown do exactly? Well, it weakened Plessy. It did not overrule Plessy, but it weakened and turned Plessy upside down with respect to education, because the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment was violated, as the court stated. It further stated that separate but equal has no place in education. The reason why the Brown case is so important because its tentacles just sort of seep through all the facets of American life. It was the catalyst for for civil rights activity, and its decision sort of was the catalyst for other decisions regarding the purchase of property, admission to movie theaters, seating on trains, dining in restaurants, and of course, college admissions. And that topic remains a hotbed today. Let me explain a little bit about mandatory takeouts. When Judge Gregory and I were growing up, there were a number of restaurants in which we could not go in and sit down and have a meal. So we had to go to the back of the restaurant, place our order, and then do takeout. So a takeout then had a different connotation than a takeout now. Needless to say, a number of Black families refused to go to the rear of a restaurant, and that's when Black restaurants really thrived. Now, the last case that was a part of the Brown ruling, which I didn't discuss in full, was the Bowling versus Sharp case. And that was mostly based on a different amendment, the Fifth Amendment. But the court still said that discrimination may be so unjustifiable as to be violative of due process. And so the court considered the issue of segregation of children in public schools on the basis of race and whether the minority children were deprived of the equal educational opportunities. And as I said above, the court held that separate but equal deprives one of equal opportunity guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. The first test after Brown was this Lucy case, very interesting case. Miss Lucy and her friend Polly Myers applied to the Masters of Education program, but the officials at the University of Alabama were unaware that they were Black. So when they showed up to register, they were not allowed to proceed with the registration process. Polly Myers and Miss Lucy refused to accept the refund of deposit, and then they engaged the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. On your left, you see Roy Wilkins, who is the executive director for the national office of the NAACP, a very prominent civil rights activist. And of course, to the right is Thurgood Marshall, whom you know became a Supreme Court justice. So Miss Lucy had to go on to the school by herself, even though Polly was the one who had persuaded her to apply in the first place. So she enrolled, but the trustees then suspended her because they said it was for her own safety, citing mob violence. So the court reinstated her. And then the Board of Trustees expelled her. And they said it was because of the defamatory and libelous remarks that were made during the hearing that went against the integrity of the president and the officers of the university. Thurgood Marshall had filed a complaint saying that the officials had conspired with the mob to prevent Lucy from attending classes. Lucy's expulsion stood until 1988 when it was rescinded and she was awarded a degree. Here is a picture of mob violence at the University of Alabama. Daisy Lee Gatson Bates and her husband were important figures in the Little Rock integration crisis in 1957. The Bates published a local Black newspaper called the Arkansas State Press, which publicized agency violations of the Supreme Court's desegregation rulings. Bates guided and advised the 9 students known as the Little Rock Nine when they attempted to enroll in Little Rock Central High School, which was previously an all-white high school during the year of 1957. You may recall that the students' attempts to enroll provoked a confrontation with Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus, who called out the National Guard to keep the students from entering the school. A mob showed up threatening to kill the students and the journalists who came to cover the story. Bates was a pivotal figure in that seminal moment of the civil rights movement. Pursuant to the Brown case, President Eisenhower then sent the 101st Airborne to protect students and to enforce the court order. Thumbing his nose at the federal government, Governor Faubus then shut down schools from 1958 to 1959. Now, Daisy Bates wasn't one that you could intimidate. In fact, during a hearing at the local school board, the school board attorney kept calling her by her first name, and she refused to respond to him. Of course, that was front page news next morning in the Arkansas Gazette. The pivotal case listed there, Bates versus Little Rock, is so important because it strengthened First Amendment rights and freedom of association for all advocacy organizations. Ms. Bates refused to turn over the list of the members of the NAACP to the Little Rock authorities, and they charged her with violating a city ordinance. She was fined, but NAACP lawyers appealed and eventually won a reversal in the United States Supreme Court. Mrs. Bates's home was threatened, and friends had to stand guard at her home for several weeks. Eventually, she was forced to leave Arkansas. Her papers suffered from loss of revenue because of her involvement with the civil rights movement, and she wrote her memoir, The Long Shadow of Little Rock. Vivian Malone was portrayed in Forrest Gump's movie. Again, she refused to be intimidated. She had a B+ average, being the first Black to graduate from the University of Alabama. The day after her enrollment, Medgar Evers, a field secretary for the NAACP in Mississippi, was shot to death in his own driveway in Jackson, Mississippi. The whole country mourned. Here is Vivian Malone registering for class at the University of Alabama on what was called an exceptionally hot day for a number of reasons. Here we see Governor George Wallace standing resolute with his confrontation with the U.S. Deputy Attorney Nicholas Kozenbach. This was called the famous stand in the schoolhouse door. And some historians say that Wallace's obstinance may have been staged. And so we remember Vivian Malone as being the first Black graduate of the University of Alabama. One of our most important scholars is Anna J. Cooper, and I am told that there is an Episcopal school named in her honor here in Richmond, Virginia. You can see that she was born a slave, attended an historically Black college, St. Augustine, and received her PhD at the University of Paris in Sorbonne. So she is considered one of the most prominent African-American scholars in United States history. She refused to take the ladies' course at St. Augustine and fought for her right to take calculus and philosophy. She married young and her husband died, so she stayed in teaching. While she was a teacher, she wrote a book, A Voice from the South, which is widely reviewed as one of the first articulations of Black feminism. The book advanced a vision of self-determination through education and social uplift for African-American women. Its central thesis was that educational, moral, and the spiritual progress of Black women would improve the standing of the entire African-American community. She says, now get this, that the violent natures of men often run counter to the goals of higher education. So it is important to foster more female intellectuals because they will bring more elegance to education. And so you see the phrase marriage bars. That was a time towards the end of the 19th century when school districts began adopting policies that barred the hiring of married women and authorized the firing of women who became married during their term or pregnant during their teaching term. The justification, of course, was that a woman's place was in the home. But by 1941, several state Supreme Courts had ruled against marriage bars. Please remember Dr. Anna J. Cooper, 1858 to 1964. Now, a number of us are familiar with Palmer Memorial Institute, which Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown founded as an upper-class educational institute for African-American students located near Greensboro, North Carolina. It started out as a one-room schoolhouse and ended up with being 300 acres and 14 buildings. The school was named after Alice Freeman Palmer, a former president of Wesley College and a benefactor of Dr. Brown's. Unfortunately, in 1971, a fire destroyed the administration and classroom buildings, and trustees were forced to close the school. It is recognized, Palmer Memorial Institute, as the only finishing school of its kind in the country, and is the first African-American state historic site. Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown, 1883 to 1961. And so we come to our illustrious Virginians, Ruth Harvey Charity, who was a native of Danville and as a student at Howard University, led sit-ins in Washington, D.C. restaurants. The Danville movement, which is referenced here, occurred in 1963, where there was a violent clash between civil rights protesters and the police. An injunction was issued against the Black protesters, preventing them from marching, and City Council passed an ordinance to support the injunction. The grand jury then issued an indictment making it a felony to incite Black people to commit insurrections against whites. There were over 600 arrests, but 10 years later, by 1973, 200 of those convictions had been overturned, primarily due to the efforts of Ruth Harvey Charity and her team. Ms. Charity focused mostly on, in her civil rights career, on opening public libraries and public parks. And I have here that she was one of the best known African-American women in the 1960s. Coming towards the close, we have Danville native, the Honorable Frankie Freeman. And even though she spent most of her adult life in St. Louis, we have to claim her because she was born in Virginia. She was part of the brain trust of the NAACP and assisted with research and strategies in civil rights cases. She gained prominence in a Supreme Court housing discrimination case. She was the first Black woman appointed to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and this is a federal agency charged with investigating and reporting civil rights issues. She was a former municipal court judge and the 14th national president of the African-American sorority that I mentioned earlier, Delta Sigma Theta. Still practicing law at 90, she lived to be 102. And so we close out with the president of Bennett College, who was there from 1956 to 1966. Bennett College was a private college for Black, or is a private college for Black women. She was the first female president and first African in the country to lead a 4-year college. She hosted Dr. Martin Luther King as a speaker when other colleges were a little reserved about doing that because they said wherever he went, violence seemed to be sparked and would not host him. But she said that Bennett College is a liberal arts school where freedom rings, and therefore Dr. Martin Luther King can speak here. She viewed education and civil rights as having a symbiotic relationship. And what I would like to point out about Dr. Player is that during the peak of the civil rights demonstrations, when nearly 40% of her Bennett student body had been arrested and was in jail because of civil rights protests and marches, Dr. Player visited the schools daily, and she encouraged her professors to do the same. She arranged for the professors to hold classes and administer exams for jail students. And that is the story of Dr. Willa B Player. And so I have offered you a panoramic view of some of the women who laid the foundation for Brown and oversaw its implementation and extended the application of the 14th Amendment. It is our duty to honor their deeds and to give them their rightful place regarding the journey to Brown versus Board of Education and beyond, and to recognize the groundwork for which they laid for future generations. Thank you.
Well, Professor Hopkins, thank you so much. That was a wonderful educational journey that you just took us on. We appreciate that. Thank you. We're going to be joined by Judge Hopkins, and we will spend a few minutes tackling some prepared questions, and we'll save a few of those minutes for audience questions. If you still would like to submit one, you can do that through the chat feature. Professor Hopkins, if you could stop sharing your screen, maybe we
Okay.
could pull Judge
All right.
Hopkins up on, or excuse me, Judge
Yeah.
Judge Gregory up on screen.
Okay.
And I'll
Got
practice getting the names right now that we are moving to this section of our program. Hello, Judge Gregory. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, Jenny, my pleasure to be here.
So first up, I had a question for you, Judge. I was struck by how many of the women that Professor Hopkins highlighted for us were unfamiliar to me. And I wondered if you had some thoughts about why these women are not better known by the general public or covered in our social studies classes.
Well, I think sadly, in particular, it's sad here because the contributions made by these women were so monumental. It's absolutely a shame that they're not covered in textbooks and not widely known by the general public. But to be honest, two reasons come out very prominently. One, they were African Americans, and two, they were women. Women only got the right to vote in America by the Constitution for 100 years. Last year was the centennial of the 19th Amendment. And African Americans, with Harriet Tubman and all of her work at the end of the Civil War, and after the Civil Rights Amendments, they called 13th, 14th, and 15th, she still couldn't vote because she was a woman. So it's regrettable, but it's quite understandable that these incredible women were not recognized because they were under the shadow of this incredible fog of not understanding what it really meant to embrace the full nuances of the human experience and progress. And lastly, I would say this: many times when we don't know what is important, we make what we do know important. And that's why these wonderful figures who are not known widely have been under this shroud. But programs like this and the great work of Beth Hopkins and just incredible encyclopedic work she just put us through is changing that, and new generations must do so.
Thank you.
And may I just add one thing, Judge? It also, isn't it determined about who's writing the history?
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, revisionist history, unfortunately, is very, very prominent. You know, the lost cause. There had to be some reason other than slavery. So these things and these people who brought to light by their lives and their sacrifices, sometimes they seem to be inconsistent with some writers and the narrative, the rosy narrative they wish to project. And you're absolutely right. It sometimes is very self-serving and intellectually dishonest.
Mm.
Exactly. Just quickly, Judge, was there a story of one of these women that resonated with you in particular?
Oh my goodness, you could pick any one of them, but I have to choose. But I'm going to say Daisy Bates.
Mm-hmm.
Daisy Bates, you know, talk about beginnings. When she was 3 years old, her mother was raped and murdered by 3 white men, and her father left, and she was put in the care and the charge of a family, foster family, and the foster father said, "Daisy, you can't just live with hate. You have to do something about it and do more." And her little heart, rather than breaking, as Hemingway said, she got stronger at the broken places.
Mm-hmm.
And she took on this in 55 when they separated. In 54, they had the right established. Separate but equal was unconstitutional, but they divided the remedy the next year to all deliberate speed. She took them for exactly what they said, speed and very deliberate, because she curated 9 students in Arkansas to say, these students are going to break that barrier at Central High School, went there in spite of the, as Beth said, the intimidation and all the threats against her, and faced the Governor Forbes, who blocked the school with the National Guard. And with her determination and those courage of those students and parents, Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne. And that was quite deliberate because the 101st Airborne was also a part of D-Day and a part of the beaches at Normandy. And who would have thought a decade later, they would come just to have 9 Negro children enter a school. And she was a big part of that. And lastly, her work in Arkansas led to the case of Cooper versus Aaron, the one that reestablished the supremacy of federal law, because a lot of southern states saying we're going to be involved in interposition and nullification. We're going to interpose our state law and nullify the federal law. And the Supreme Court said, no, the decision in Brown is supreme and you cannot stand in the way of the mandate of the Constitution. And thank God for Daisy Bates and many others, but she was very impressive.
Well, thank you for that. I want to shift gears just a tad and Professor Hopkins ask you, do you think conditions are better for Black Americans in the 21st century than in the 20th century?
That's a loaded question.
I know. I can say they were going to be easy.
Well, if you peel back the layers of the onion and you ask, has progress been made? Certain. We don't have to do mandatory takeouts. We don't have to go to the state fair and enter where the pigs and the chickens were in pens, because that's what we had, where that was the entrance, the only entrance we could go through when we were children. In most places in the United States, we can buy a home. Now, how we obtain mortgages is a whole nother issue. And so in a lot of respects, conditions are better. However, when you look at the present housing discrimination issues and the moratorium being lifted on evictions and the voting rights issue, you know, you wonder, and you know, are we going around in circles? Because I just thought we were moving forward in voting rights, and you know, with the recent Supreme Court decisions that sort of flipped everything and photo IDs, I knew that we were headed in the wrong direction. But I didn't think we would get to so many states seeking to nullify the efforts of people to have the right to vote. And I, you know, and I didn't even get to Fannie Lou Hamer, who suffered and marched just so that we would have the right to vote. So it's a double-loaded question. I would say yes, in many instances, conditions are better, but we cannot sit on our tushes. We have to be courageous, we have to move forward, we have to be vigilant, and we have to educate our young people.
Is that sort of your thoughts on how we as Americans move forward on this issue?
Yeah, you got to know your history. You got to know your past before you can move into the future. You know, and especially our history is just missing. It's been missing in action, and our children, our African-American children, are not aware of the sacrifices and the great things that some of our people have done. I mean, look at Benjamin Banneker. How many 6th and 7th graders know about Benjamin Banneker? And some of the, I mean, how many Black kids know that the stoplight was invented by a Black man? I mean, so that's why I said we gotta get our kids back into the history of how we got, where we came from, how we got here, and how we have endured.
Well, that leads me to another question that I had, and I think at that point we may have to switch over and take some of our audience questions. But to you, Judge Gregory, whenever we talk about Brown versus Board of Education, it seems that the conversation can go any of about 30 different ways, any one of which could be the platform for the next iteration of the Marshall Scholar Series. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about whether we spend enough time discussing Brown, what led to Brown, what happened in the Brown case, and the resistance to Brown after, both in our communities and in our courtrooms. Do you think that we examine it and learn enough?
No, the short answer is no, we don't. And when I say we, I'm talking about all Americans, whatever their color, stripe, or whatever, however they identify themselves. Because the rich part of it, the rich parts of it, every time you look, you see a new one. And one of them to say this, there is, I don't think, any example more incredibly courageous and wise than the strategy for Brown. And the laboratory was Howard University, a historically Black college that was founded in, right after the Civil War in Freeman's Bureau. And in the 1930s, there, with Charles Hamilton Houston, with students like Thurgood Marshall and Oliver Hill and many other greats, said, we are going to bring down the walls of segregation. And they came up with the strategy to go against equalization. Okay, Pleasant said it's supposed to be separate and equal. Let's test equal. And we're going to run them ragged, and they're going to do this. They'll spend a lot of money. The war of attrition. And then there were gains, like, pardon the pun, end gains in cases like Beth so eloquently laid out. I don't need to say again. But then they switched into, let's take on Plessy directly. And in the 1950s, they started these cases. Again, these 5 cases were meticulously picked. They made sure that some schools were almost equal. One was federal, one was state, one where the petitioners won in Delaware, so that the decision would cover the whole United States when they prevail. Brilliant. And lawyers that were awesome. That's just a subcategory. So when you talk about skills and abilities and understanding the Constitution, the highest level of intellectual engagement put to practical use for incredible human progress, Brown is an incredible story for everyone, and everyone in the American spirit can take heart that this came with a great cost and they gave a great contribution. So the Brown story is rich and it continually must be told, and the work left undone must be completed.
Thank you. We've got a couple questions who have come in from our audience members that I wanted to take a few minutes to address since we are at the top of the hour. First one, do you know what became of Reverend Brown and his daughter?
I've forgotten.
Well, I think she did very well because it was incredible, absolutely brilliant person. I met her because I was on the commission appointed by Chief Justice Rehnquist to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Brown. And we went to all 5 states and started in Massachusetts with the Sarah Roberts case. And she was the leader and brilliant and wonderful in working in the museum and her efforts to get the museum in Topeka. So she's doing very well and still carrying on the tradition of progress. Yes.
Okay, question number 2. Who are some Virginia women that you are impressed with today and why?
Judge, I'm gonna let you take that because I just moved here.
Oh, women, oh, like in Virginia? In Virginia?
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. I mean, you know, when you start calling names, it's real tough. But certainly I think that, you know, I'm getting into politics and leaders, but just many people who have stepped to the plate, and the African-American women who are in the Senate, you know, Lucas, who's just incredible. You have mayors, you know, you have judges like Judge Renda Wright, who's there, the Norfolk Federal District Judge. Very impressive. You have Cleo Powell, who's a justice on the Supreme Court of Virginia. And you have just many other, Senator McClellan, Jennifer McClellan, who's in the state Senate. In many ways, in many fields, is just doing an incredible job. And you just, Dr. Gooden, who's head of the Wilder School of Public Policy at VCU. So many of them who work in the trenches, and as I think it was Frederick Douglass said about Harriet Tubman, sometimes their devotion is only witnessed by a few people who are helped and the midnight stars.
Oh, wow. And one of our viewers would like to know if Professor Hopkins is planning to write a book to share this information and your commentary on it.
Right now, I'm trying to get settled in Virginia. I moved here from Winston-Salem in November, And perhaps the book would be in the works, but there are a lot more scholarly people than I would even claim to be about this area. I just have a particular interest because I taught race and the law as a seminar course at Wake Forest. And my dad was one who made us read at age 5, and I was always reading about how great Africa was. And so, you know, I was familiar with Mansa Musa at an early age and some of the great African kings and queens. So I was a history major at Wake Forest, and it's just part of my DNA. Thank you for that shout out, though.
Well, maybe we can talk you into joining us for another installation of the Marshall Scholar Series.
My pleasure.
Do you think we are still practicing a form of separate but equal in our schools today?
Who do you want to take that one?
Why don't you take that, Professor Hopkins?
Well, in some respects we are, because of the neighborhood school concept. And again, that's a double-edged sword as well. You know, busing is not as much of a pariah as it was in the 1970s. But if you go to a number of schools in the neighborhoods, you can tell the community by looking at who's attending the schools.
Okay, the next question from one of our viewers is, now that segregation is legally barred, do you think integration will happen naturally, or must desegregation be promoted by law? Is desegregation different from integration? Judge Gregory, any thoughts on that one?
Well, yes, it is. It is different. To desegregate is exactly what the law mandated. It did through many ways of busing, changing school plans and things like that. And some places, like in my hometown, it was easy. Once there was integration, it was one high school. So if you went to public high school, that was only one. But the biggest problem, but integration is more of a spirit that's voluntary and an acceptance and an embrace. That's longer. It takes a longer time because of historic housing discrimination and many patterns and prejudices and pre-notion. Let me just say this real quick, just to answer the question, in a sense, give an idea of what makes integration difficult. Beth's mother taught me chemistry, and so connection in high school. And I took honors chemistry, and we were having a project with the Math Science Conference. Real quickly, this is when schools were segregated. We went to Virginia Union, Virginia State, Virginia Randolph, and we competed in the sciences and in math. And this was wonderful. We've been doing this for years. But when we went to Petersburg High and came together, one high school, they ended that. And I said, it was almost like we had nothing to offer in the merger, in the integration. Integration comes when you can respect that all of us bring rich experiences, ideals, and intellect to the table. Desegregation is looked at the hammer, forces in. Integration says, I realize I'm bereft of something if I don't have you there. I can't be all that I should be without you. That's what makes it difficult, because it is a merge of the heart and spirit and the understanding of the dignity of all people. And we have a long ways to go for that. Yes, we do.
Absolutely. So I like this next question that came in. We probably have time for maybe one or two more. As we move forward in education, what are either of your recommendations on how to teach African American history in a more holistic way?
Well, in my class, we did a lot of readings from different authors. And also we did some role playing. I had a project where I assigned each student in my class an African American historical figure, such as a Maynard Jackson or Governor Wilder or Julian Bond. And I put 4 students on a panel at a time, maybe 5. And I had a different question for each panel. And the students had to answer the question in terms of how their historical figure would have answered it. So you just have to come up with some innovative ways and interactive ways to make it real. I mean, it's a rich history. It just hasn't been told. And it's not that difficult to find scholars, such as the one that we have at Wake Forest University, Dr. Tony Parent, who's written a book that is used by Virginia schools. And so if you call upon the people who know, they would definitely help you or help educators with the process of incorporating Black history and making it pop.
Okay, we've gone a little bit over our allotted time, but I wanted to end on this one. What advice do you give to get more African-American children interested in law and history? Sort of speaking to your pop.
Well, in my case, it came from the home. So, and then also we had Sunday school in the church, and there was always this focus on Black history in the church. Now, since we're going back to church and as we go into our organizations and interact, just talk about the great things. Pick out the interesting people, like some of the women that I've talked about today. And I left out a whole number of women, but it's so wonderful to know about these people. And once you put it out there, I think the young people will grab it. And certainly the history of Black women needs to be taught as a person wrote started in the kindergarten area and up through high school. So it's not that difficult. It's not that difficult. You just gotta love it. You gotta embrace it. And the students will sense your enthusiasm and they will become part of the team.
Well, the stories are certainly rich and interesting and engaging and should be used, I think, in our classrooms. So on that, I just want to say thank you so much, Judge Gregory, Professor Hopkins, for taking on this very important and impactful conversation. Both of you were lovely tonight, and we appreciate you being here with us. And thank you to our viewers, and please think about joining us in the next round of the Marshall Scholar Series. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night, Jenny. Good night, Beth. Blessings.
Good night, Judge.
All right.